One humid afternoon, Talia woke up, her skin glistening with sweat as the weight of the air seemed to stick to her. She sat up in bed in the absolutely quiet room. She heard the far-off sound of a neighbor's dog barking, but it had little effect to ease her sudden fear. Arlo, her husband, vanished from sight. So he said. He had left early that morning for a work conference. Talia's phone buzzed on the bedside table, while her heart thung against her ribs. Not only any message, it came from Nora. Nora, a name she never would have connected with risk. Between them, the books had begun innocuously, compliments on each other's work, casual life advice. Talia was a glass sculptor, her hands frequently submerged in molten glass shaped delicate complex beauty from anarchy. Conversely, Nora was a conservationist, someone intensely committed to protecting threatened species, usually visiting far-off rainforests and abandoned islands. On the surface, their worlds were obviously quite different. But under the surface, something else simmered. Friends, sorry to interrupt, but please help me reach 2,000 subscribers by the end of the summer. Let's keep going. Talia's marriage had become far off weeks before. Arlo, who ran a little chain of boutique tech companies, had become cold, and his love for her was fading without clear reason. Her doubts about her place in his life had come from the long, quiet dinners and sleepless nights when he avoided touching her. Then, Nora joined in. Talia first gave it little thought. She and Nora had met at a gallery exhibiting her sculptures. Their quick clicks bonded them over their common love of art and the fine equilibrium of life. But things evolved. Talia felt herself sliding into a world she did not know as their texts grew more personal and their calls more frequent. An uncertain, exciting, dangerous world. 1 month later, she at last told herself she had fallen in love with Nora. Talia's pulse sped that afternoon as her phone buzzed with another text. She need not open it to find out what it said. Already Nora's words were encircling her heart, dragging her into a love she had not known she was capable of. But today, it seemed different. There was a flaw. Talia then saw Arlo's journal open on his desk. She had never been one to pry into his affairs, but her feet moved without thinking, as if the book were calling her. Her fingers followed the leather-bound edges, and she turned the pages gingerly, not to damage the worn spine. It first appeared to be any other regular journal. Business notes, lists of chores, personal reflections. Her breath caught, though, as she approached the last few entries. Arlo had discussed her in her work, and not just her about Nora. Talia read the words, her heart stopping. I know, I'm familiar with Nora. His handwriting became jagged, almost wild, as if he had lost emotional control. The rest of the entry grew darker and loaded with initially illogical words. Everything fell into focus only when Talia arrived at the last line. She thinks I don't see it. But I do. She will pay for this turnabout. She will both. Talia felt panic sweep over her. Her phone went straight to voicemail when she grabbed it and tried to call Nora. Her stomach knitted under tightening knots. Nora was at where? Had Arlo already treated her in such manner? She hurried to the window and looked for Arlo's car across the street. For weeks now, the pit of fear building inside her threatened to swallow her whole. She had to track Nora to warn her. Talia heard nothing from Nora over several hours. Arlo hadn't even returned either. She decided at last to visit the police in desperation. Detective Amara Alvi greeted her grimly at the station. Amara was a seasoned investigator noted for her unflinching determination and keen sense of smell. She listened closely as Talia stammered through her tale, her words shaking with anxiety. The affair, the notebook, Arlo's disturbing warnings, all of it spilled out in a disorganizing mess. Though Amara nodded silently, her eyes told Talia this was more than just another case. Arlo's abrupt disappearance and the reference to Nora's name had set people on alert. We'll investigate, she said, her voice steady, but behind her calm exterior, a storm building. 2 days later, a terrible discovery was made. A regular hiker, he came upon the body while exploring a remote woodland area some miles distant. The area was well known for its untainted paths and thickets, hardly the kind of place the public visited. But the hiker discovered no natural accident, of course. Under a meager layer of soil, Nora's body lay buried, her face hardly discernible. Introduced by a specialized forensic team, cadaver dogs had rapidly verified the presence of a second body, not far from where Nora was discovered. It was a burial site built quickly, a pit dug in an area few would visit. Arlo's second body came from here. Talia's universe collapsed as detectives searched the area. She had known something awful had happened. But this? Dead and buried in the woods were the woman she loved as well as her husband. Still, how? Though the questions whirled constantly in Talia's head, the responses would not flow naturally. She knew simply that something had gone terribly, tragically wrong. Detective Amara started putting together the last hours of both victims' life as the inquiry dug further. Still, the hints were far from obvious. Someone had gone to great care to ensure these secrets remained buried. For Talia, the days following the terrible discovery were a haze of questions, forensic reports, and restless nights. Detective Amara Alvi pursued the truth relentlessly, but with every discovery the riddle around Arlo and Nora's deaths only grew more complex. The remote funeral site and the hurried way, both bodies had been buried, suggested a crime carried out in desperation. But under what direction? Also, why? Talia's feelings were a messy tangle, her mind playing every moment with Nora, every glance, every touch that had dragged them further into their perilous affair. Guilt tore at her. She couldn't help but wonder, though, as she sat in the police station's cold, austere room. Had Arlo been the one to find their secret and exact a deadly retribution, only to meet a terrible fate himself? Alternatively, was another hand working in this twisted drama? Working with a group of forensic experts, Detective Amara was rigorous. Arlo's phone records produced the first revelation. Talia had assumed, but his last calls were to an unidentified number that Detective Amara found connected to a burner phone, not to business partners or clients. This revelation sparked questions right away. Who Arlo had been in touch with, and why had he kept it secret? Talia's found journal entry turned out to be a main source of proof. Arlo's fury over the affair was evident in it, but his words by themselves couldn't establish he had been plotting something evil. More bothered Amara was the fact the journal, full of hurried notes about betrayal, stopped suddenly. Arlo's intended behavior upon his wrath was not discussed, nor whether he had confronted Talia or Nora. It left a terrible void in the story that simply heightened the mystery. Another level of difficulty came from forensic study of the crime scene where the bodies were discovered. The cadaver dogs had guided researchers to the precise spot, and the soil samples soon exposed something startling. Arlo had been dead days before Nora. The emphasis of the research changed along with the drastically changed chronology. It was about someone else totally, someone who had planned the deaths of both Arlo and Nora. Not about a husband seeking retribution on his cheating wife and lover. Talia was called back to the station once more, her nerves raw from the never-ending barrage of inquiries. This time, Detective Amara's line of research shifted. Existed any enemies for Arlo? Her eyes tracking Talia's every movement, she asked. Anyone who would like to hurt him? Someone who might have found the affair and exploited it to exacerbate problems? Talia stammered. Although Arlo was a private man, over the years his tech company attracted some competitors. Once, Arlo had a nasty conflict with a former business partner, claiming intellectual property theft in a lawsuit. Still, that had been resolved months ago. Is there any way that might relate to his death? Amara descended further into Arlo's past, interviewing even relatives and former colleagues. What surfaced was a picture of a man who had been spiraling in his personal life, yet outwardly successful. He struggled financially. Debt Talia had not known about dogged him. A few staff members mentioned Arlo's erratic behavior in the weeks before his death, and one even mentioned seeing him with a woman, not Talia. Talia was taken aback by this disclosure. Had Arlo been hiding personal secrets? Examining Nora's death also raised equally alarming questions. Nora, a conservationist, had gone regularly, usually to far-off sites. She had, however, been engaged in a bitter conflict recently with a business entity seeking to develop land Nora had been trying to protect. Threats, veiled hostility in emails, and anonymous notes cautioning her to back off abound. Though it was another lead Detective Amara could not overlook, it was unclear if this struggle over territory had descended into murder. Then followed the revelation that rocked the whole case. Investigators found the burner phone Arlo had used in his last days in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. The digits on the screen matched his most recent call. Still more unsettling was the apartment itself. At least on the surface, it belonged to a woman named Kira, a quiet, understated florist with no apparent relationship to either Arlo or Nora. But as Detective Amara dug further into Kira's life, an astonishing relationship surfaced. Kira had been friend of Nora's. She had actually known Nora for years, long before Talia had ever come into focus. And lately, it seemed, Kira had become jealously even of the relationship developing between Nora and Talia. When presented with this material, Kira stayed cool, sitting in the interrogation room, wearing an invisible mask. "I loved Nora," she said, her voice low but steady. However, she not loved me the way I wanted back. Then, when I learned of her and Talia, her voice faded, but the fury under her words was clear. Claiming she had no knowledge of Arlo's death, Kira insisted she had only wanted to warn him about the affair and hoped her intervention would drive Nora away from Talia. But Kira's narrative started to fall apart as the questioning carried on. Text messages on her phone showed she had been in touch with Arlo, feeding his mistrust of Talia's treachery and driving him toward the brink. And Kira, who had been hiding in the shadows waiting for the confrontation to get violent, was there when Arlo eventually faced Nora. Still, events had not gone as expected. Rather, of Nora, it had been Arlo, his body buried in the forest, killed first. Kira had not expected that, and over the course of several days, her fixation on Nora had darkened. Detective Amara's team put together the rest of the story. Kira had lured Nora into the forest under the pretense of seeing Arlo, only to kill her in a flash of jealous wrath. It was evident as the inquiry turned on Kira that she had been a master manipulator, arranging the deaths of two people she thought had offended her, not only a jilted lover. But justice, as always, would arrive, though the road to it was not clear-cut. Everyone who knew Kira found her arrest startling. Friends and acquaintances painted her as a quiet, reserved woman who appeared unable of such violence. Benevolent on the surface, though, was a mind twisted by obsession and jealousy. Now convinced of Kira's guilt, Detective Amara Alvi turned over her results to the district attorney. Although a trial was unavoidable, nobody could have foreseen the storm that would develop. Talia was called to testify. Her grief and uncertainty were evident on her stance. Readers, reporters, and those who had followed the case from start crowded the courtroom. The weight of her losses had dulled Talia's once vibrant attitude. Her husband, although far away, had been a part of her life for years, and Nora, the woman she had loved fervently, was now always lost to her. She sat before the jury, and the prosecutor started to gently but completely remove the layers of her involvement. The prosecutor started, his voice measured. "Tell us about your relationship with Nora." Talia let out a strong swallow. She said, her voice wobbly, "It started as a friendship. We convened in an art gallery. But it grew more and more. I never could have predicted it. Though I wanted to spare Arlo. Did you ever think Arlo, your husband, knew about the affair before you came upon his notebook?" The prosecutor interrupted. Talia paused, recalling the anxiety she had felt when she first turned over Arlo's words. "No. I had no idea he knew. He never said anything or hinted. But when I read what he had produced," the prosecutor nodded, letting some quiet pass before picking back up. "And you have informed us that the day before Nora's body was discovered was your last visit to her." "Indeed," Talia said, tears filling her eyes. She claimed she had to look after something, but she wouldn't say what. "I never considered it to be the last time I would ever see her." The prosecutor turned his focus to Kai Donnelly, the defense attorney who had developed his career on high-profile cases. But his approach was not clear, since he had stayed mostly quiet during the first sessions. Now, Talia was finishing her testimony. He got up from his seat with an incomprehensible look. "Miss Talia," said Donnelly, his voice as cool as a pond on a windless day, "I want to be clear. Indeed, you have said you had an affair with Nora." "Yes," Talia said, her voice hardly above a whisper. "And throughout this affair, did you ever know Kira felt something for Nora?" "Nora never mentioned her either." Talia blinks in uncertainty. "Nora told me they were buddies. She never mentioned Kira or her feelings." Nodding slowly in front of the jury, Donnelly paced. "However, one could argue that Nora's choice to engage herself in a romantic relationship with you while knowing Kira harbors feelings for her could be considered as merciless. The query hung in the air like a poison cloud. The courtroom whispered in reply, and the prosecutor got up right away. "Objection, Your Honor. That inquiry is just hypothetical and unrelated to the current situation." An elderly woman with keen eyes. The judge nodded. Sustained. "Mr. Donnelly, stay to the facts." Donnelly gave a courteous smile before ongoing. "Of course, Your Dignity." He turned back to Talia, rereading. "Would you say Nora's actions, being involved with you while keeping a close friendship with Kira, may have confused Kira, maybe led her to believe there was more between them than just friendship?" In her chest, Talia's heart hammered. "I'm not sure," she replied honestly. "Nora never discussed Kira like that with me." The defense seemed to be treading carefully, trying to sow uncertainty without specifically accusing Nora or Talia of misbehavior. The jury was sharp, though, and they could see through Donnelly's attempts to muddy the waters. When the forensic team presented their results, the most damning proof came. DNA from Kira had been discovered on Nora's and Arlo's bodies. Strands of hair, skin cells, and traces of her presence in Arlo's automobile. Combining text messages between Kira and Arlo with this evidence, the prosecution mostly relied on it to show she had actively contributed to aggravating his paranoia about the affair. One note caught me. "You deserve better than her. She is not who you believe her to be. We'll see to it she cannot harm you anymore." As the message came on a big screen, the courtroom gasped. Kira's face stayed still, but her clenched hands betrayed her inner struggle. Emphasizing Kira's manipulation of Arlo, the prosecutor continued forward, implying that she had not only planned to kill Nora, but also jealousies and resentment drove her murder. Knowing the seriousness of the matter, the defense adjusted strategy. From questioning Talia and Nora's relationship, Donnelly changed his focus to show Kira as mentally sick. Kira had behaved out of emotional instability, he said, motivated by unmet love and a past of untreated psychological trauma. He asked a psychiatrist who had seen Kira suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder to testify that her condition had progressed into delusions about her relationship with Nora. The jury, though, showed no enthusiasm. The prosecution piecemeal destroyed the defense's argument over the next several days. They showed Kira's meticulous preparation, her acquisition of the burner phone, the thorough research she had done on Arlo and Nora, even her monitoring of the couple's movements in the weeks before the murders. Kira was not someone lost in a flash of passion acting. They were methodically calculated, extremely sinister. It was obvious by the time closing arguments were presented that Kira had killed not only out of jealousy. Using Arlo as a pawn in her twisted game, she had savored in her control over the circumstances, and she had coldly killed Nora and him when things spiraled out of her reach. Before rendering their decision, guilty on all counts, the jury debated for 2 days. Kira received a life-in-prison sentence devoid of parole possibility, except for the soft sobs of Nora's friends and Talia, who sat shattered, grieving both the lives lost and the tragedy of a love that never had a chance to blossom. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered his sentence. Though justice had been done, nobody left without injury. The community was stunned by the aftermath. Those who had known Kira for years battled to fit the monster exposed during the trial with the quiet florist they had once loved. Though free from doubt, Talia felt no comfort in the result. She had lost all: her sense of peace, her husband, the woman she loved. Regarding Detective Amara, the case haunted her long after the trial concluded. There were unanswered questions even with the resolution. What Kira had really thought in those last minutes, and whether any of it could have been stopped. But that, like the lives destroyed by the catastrophe, was something no study could ever totally explain. Months went by following the trial, but the echoes of the catastrophe persisted over all those engaged. Talia tried to put her life back together, but it seemed as though each effort just resulted in more pieces and more memories of what she had lost. She found herself renting a little apartment on the outskirts of town, having left the house she had shared with Arlo, the place where her life had once seemed so safe. It was quiet, solitary, just what she needed. Talia was a glass sculptor who had stopped working. Her once fueling creative energy seemed to have dried up and was replaced by an extreme guilt and hopelessness. Her hands would tremble every time she tried to hold a piece of molten glass, and she would see Nora's face, smiling then twisted in fear, until the glass cooled and hardened into a shapeless lump. She stopped trying totally, at last. Her days were lost in a fog, going over the events that had preceded that fatal day. She asked herself what she might have done differently. She could have seen the indicators before things got out of hand. Should she have left Nora? She knew, though, these ideas were useless. For her, at least, the future seemed dismal. The past was unchangeable. Not just Talia was having trouble moving on. Haunted by the case, Detective Amara Alvi had been so vital in solving the riddle. Over her career, she had handled several challenging cases, but this one stayed with her in a manner she had not anticipated. All of Kira's calculated nature of crimes, her manipulation of Arlo, and the cold-blooded way she had killed 2 people in search of her twisted needs, gnawed at Amara's mind. Amara started to second her own decisions and wonder whether she had missed anything. Could Kira have stopped before? Had there been indicators that nobody else observed? Her nights were troubled by these questions, which also interfered with her sleep and caused second guess. On fresh cases, her colleagues observed the change in her, but Amara dismissed their worries and dug more into her work to forget about the case. Kira stayed as mysterious as ever, even serving her life sentence in a maximum security prison. She had shown little feeling during the trial, and prison did not help her to break her cold favors. Fascinated by the woman who had killed out of unmet love, some prisoners murmured about her. Others stayed away, feeling the gloom that seemed to hang about her. Kira spent most of her time in silence in her cell, her thoughts her only company. She had no regrets, at least not ones she would ever confess to. For her, what she had done was reasonable. She thought she had behaved out of love, a love denied, ridiculed, and finally betrayed in her warped mind. It was unforgivable how Nora turned away, and Talia interfered. Kira had sought to recover control the only way she knew how, since the hurt of losing Nora had been too much. Kira couldn't avoid the memories even in jail, though. She couldn't get rid of the look Nora's face in those last minutes, the blood on her hands, the emptiness that followed. No matter her efforts to persuade herself that she had done the right thing, they tormented her. Ultimately, Kira was imprisoned not only by the prison walls, but also by the knowledge she had destroyed the very thing she professed to love. The community was likewise left reeling. Every element of the trial had been reported by the media, and as the sensationalism subsided, the reality set in. Those who knew Arlo, Talia, Nora, even Kira, were left with the painful reality that they had hardly really known them at all. As they usually do in small towns, rumors proliferated, and everyone had a view on who was responsible. A few even pitied Kira, thinking she was a victim of her own mind, while others blamed Nora for guiding Kira on, and others Talia for her affair. But the whispers quietened, and life continued. Time passed. Though the town went back to its regular rhythms, the tragedy never really disappeared. It stayed in the background, a reminder of how rapidly and permanently life might be destroyed. In solitude, Talia finally found herself going back to her passion, sculpting. At first slow, the glass started to take form under her hands as they became steady. The heat of the furnace and the delicate process of shaping something exquisite from raw, molten material brought her comfort. It was a kind of therapy, a means of focusing her loss into something she could control and something physical. Her new creations deviated from all she had produced in past years. It reflected the turbulence inside her and was darker, more abstract. But it was also lovely in its own right, a monument to her resiliency and her capacity to produce, even among devastation. One piece especially caught people's attention. A big, eerie sculpture of 2 figures entwined, their forms almost exactly matched but yet distinctly apart. It was called Unbreakable, and when it was eventually shown in a nearby gallery, it attracted throngs of people, many of whom understood the deeper significance of the work. It was a memorial to Nora, to the love they had, and to the suffering of loss that almost claimed Talia, but she had finally survived. For Talia, the gallery exhibition signaled a sea change. Far from it, she was not healed, but she was starting to find a road forward. She still dreamed, woke up in the middle of the night with weight on her chest, but the act of creation gave her direction and a means of facing the darkness within her. Regarding Detective Amara, she finally moved on from the case, never really left her. She went on solving other crimes and, where she could, bringing justice. Every so often, though, she would retrieve the file on Arlo and Nora's murders from her alone in her office, leafing through the pages as though in search of some response that escaped her. Ultimately, the case turned into a narrative, a warning about the perils of obsession, of secrets, of love twisted beyond recognition. For those who had lived it, though, it was more than just a narrative. It was a scar, a continual reminder of the frailty of life and of the narrow line separating love from hate. Though the wounds left behind would never totally heal, justice had been done. For most years later, the catastrophe that had claimed so many lives had become a far-off memory. Talia kept working as a sculptor. Her work is now known for its emotional intensity and terrible beauty. Though she had never completely escaped the suffering, she had learnt to live with it and channeled her loss into every work. Though brief, the love she had with Nora became ingrained in her soul, something she could not forget, but rather embraced as part of her narrative. Now, a forgotten person, Kira stayed locked away, serving her life sentence in the chilly isolation of prison. Her name no longer generated whispers or mystery as the world had progressed. Still, inside her cell, the memories persisted. Her obsession had long since passed for a hollow emptiness. Her distorted form of love had ultimately wrecked everything she had ever wanted. Too forward had been Detective Amara Alvi. She had closed many more cases, each one adding to her reputation as a gifted investigator. But occasionally, late at night, the memory of that cold, twisted case would surface, a reminder of the thin line separating passion from devastation. As it always does, the planet kept turning. Though never exactly the same, the lives ripped apart by love and treachery were rebuilt. Though for those who survived, there is something to be said for endurance. The tragedy left its imprint. Life carried on in its peculiar and stubborn manner, even in the wake of disaster.